Hi, welcome to Personality Hacker. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge. And in this week's podcast, we're going to talk about rules, personal rules, rules that we create ourselves that inform how we believe reality should work. Mm-hmm. Those are personal rules. And not too long ago, I was going through Anthony Robbins' book, Awaken the Giant Within, writing down all of the maps and models that I found in that book. And I came up with 25. There's 25 different models that he goes over in the book, Awaken the Giant Within, which, by the way, is a brilliant book if you've never read it. I'm pretty sure I missed some, too. I'm pretty sure there's probably more than 25 models. But one of them that really stood out to me was the model that he has around personal rules. And in particular, why we create them and what they do for us. Like how our personal rules can either inform whether or not we have a happy existence or a miserable existence. And what an empowering or a disempowering personal rule is. So I wanted to talk about that model a little bit. Basically go over, sort of these concepts of like, are some of my rules actually not working for me? Are there rules that I have that I don't even recognize are rules about my reality? And maybe just do a little bit of a deeper dive into that concept.
Sure. We've talked, I think, in the past about developing core values for yourself. And at Personality Hacker in general, we talk about this idea of what are your core values? What are the things that are non-negotiables for you? And kind of there's a hierarchy to them. There's things that, I have a core value around this thing in my life. And I think when we're talking about rules, we're talking about taking that core value, it may be a little more esoteric, a little bit more open-framed core value, and we're codifying it a little bit more. A personal rule is kind of taking maybe the core value of honesty. A rule from that might be, I'm not going to lie to other people. And then another rule might be, and I'm not going to lie to myself. So the core value of honesty is given like this codified kind of, and is it in all contexts I won't lie, or is it certain context? And you kind of start to codify what the core value of honesty looks like for you. I think that's what we're talking about when we talk about personal rules.
Yeah, well, and those are the good ones, and then there's the bad ones. There are also personal rules that we might not even be aware of or conscious of that are also informing how we feel. And they could be something like, I didn't know this, but I have a rule around fairness. And I believe that unless something is totally fair, then it's wrong. Right, like, and you could define fairness however you want to. Like, we get the exact same amount of marshmallows in our hot chocolate. Mm-hmm. Like, if you get one more marshmallow in your hot chocolate than I get in my hot chocolate, that's unfair, and I'm gonna feel bad about that because I have some sort of personal rule about fairness.
Yeah.
So the good ones, the ones that are kind of good rules, personal rules, are the ones that we conscientiously have created. Like, I'm not going to be, I'm not going to lie to myself. What's interesting about personal rules, though, is that it's not a real rule unless lying to yourself and discovering it truly does make you feel bad. You know whether or not something is a personal rule based on the impact it has on you, based on its effect. And it could be a value you have. It could be something that you like to make into a rule. But if you say lie to yourself and you discover it and go, oh, well, I'll do better next time, then that's actually not one of those personal rules we're talking about.
Mm.
How you are emotionally impacted based on whether or not you or somebody else is observing this rule is effectively whether or not that's a rule to begin with.
And when we talk about rules, we're talking about something that seems like it's constructed from the external world. So I'm going to make a list of my personal rules, but what you just said is you might not be even aware of the personal rules you've developed in your heart, and until it's like trampled upon. Like you might have something like what you said, like something that you feel strongly about, like fairness, and then you feel like there's an unfair situation. All of a sudden you feel this strong emotion and you're like, why am I feeling this strong sense of anger or disappointment or injustice or righteous indignation? Oh, maybe I've got a personal rule about fairness that I wasn't even aware of until the situation brought that emotion up in me.
Yeah.
So it's kind of reverse engineering what rules you've written on your heart in a sense, and in a conscious way and maybe a subconscious way.
Yeah, well, and Tony Robbins in the book says that all upsets are rules upsets, meaning that every time you're upset, it means that one of your rules was offended in some way. So I think that's kind of powerful. to recognize that if we're feeling bad, it's not because somebody else, quote unquote, made us feel bad. It's because a rule of ours was offended or not honored in some way. And if we can recognize what those rules are, we have some power to change them. If we don't even know that we have this unconscious rule going on inside of us, then we don't have the ability to maybe alter it or change it or redirect it into a different sort of rule. We just are on the receiving end of how it makes us feel.
I think I must have a rule around parking lots because it really angers me when someone doesn't park properly. And I can't get into I come out of like a store from shopping and I can't open my car door because they pulled too close to me or they've come in crooked and now it's hard for me to get my car out. So I must have a personal rule around like parking, but that's kind of how it works. Like I've got this thing, like this is how you park. You park straight in, you don't block people in. And I've got like this personal rule that I didn't even know about till you just mentioned this. I was thinking about things in my life that trigger me sometimes. And that would be an example of something like that. That's kind of a benign example, but it's an example of something that's like, it's a frustration and anger comes out because it's a rule of mine.
Totally. Absolutely. Yeah. And actually that's a good way to segue into what do we mean when we say rules, right? Personal rules. Because we can kind of been dancing around it, but let's be more specific. So the way that Tony Robinson defines a personal rule in the book Awaken the Giant Within is, number one, a rule is what has to happen in order for us to feel good. So that's the first way to define a personal rule. What has to happen in order for us to feel good? The second way is basically rules are our definition of what's good, what's bad, what we should do, and what we must do. All right, so those are all rules. What's good, what's bad, what we should do, and what we must do. And then he also defines a rule or kind of explains why we get these rules. Is he says that they're shortcuts for our brains to give a sense of certainty about consequences for actions, to make lightning quick decisions. So there are, over time we observe consequences to actions and we determine what are the ideal or the desirable consequences and what are the undesirable consequences. And then in order to make really quick decisions that will lead us to our desirable consequences, which of course come with a feeling of, that was a good feeling. I like that feeling. I feel good about that. Then we start to create rules which will far more quickly get us to that good feeling, to get us to the desirable consequence of the action.
So you mentioned this idea of, rules are shortcuts to make decisions quickly. And I think I've seen, when especially like in a society, for example, we're not talking about personal rules now, we're talking about like societal rules. There are rules that are kind of across the board just to make things easy, decisions to be easy. So in the United States, for example, when you pull up to a stop sign, we're on the right side of the road in the United States. Somebody that pulls up at the same time to a stop sign at a four-way intersection, the person to the right gets the right of way. That's just a rule that helps us make a decision when two people pull up to an intersection at the same time. And I think what you're talking about is do that for your personal self. When a rule comes into your life, it's a way for you to be able to make a decision without having to think a lot about the decision you're making. So it makes things faster and easier to move through the world. And if you didn't have that, everything would have to be contextualized in the moment, and it would slow moving through life down. You could barely function. You have to have these in order to make decisions so you can get through life, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no, and actually that makes me think of the town we live in has all these four-way stops. And I don't know if this part of driving culture just completely missed
the memo.
They just totally missed the memo. Because when you pull up to a four-way stop, if you pull up at the same time, like 9 times out of 10 the person on the right will wave you through. Right? Because the town that we live in, their personal rule is all about courtesy, right? They want you to take the right of way no matter what. And because I grew up in cities or learned to drive mostly in cities, this drives me crazy because I'm like, the first thing I think of is, okay, I go and you choose to ram into the side of my car and I'm at fault because I took the right of way when I didn't have it, right? The courteous 60-year-old woman who just waved me through is not going to now take the opportunity to ram the side of my car in order to go for an insurance scam, I'm pretty sure. However, that always goes through my head every time. I'm like, I don't have the right of way. And it offends my rule, right? It offends my rule of, going based on these overarching rules which make everybody's life easier. But because of this cultural pattern of waving people through, I've noticed that when people pull up to a four-way stop, they have absolutely no idea who should have the right of way.
Yeah.
Right? Like, they don't know. They're not familiar with that rule anymore because they've basically, like, they've conditioned their way out of that rule. And so every time you pull up, you've got people who are like waving each other through and other people who are getting upset and frustrated and people shaking their heads and like, idiot. And actually, this attempt to be courteous has ended up creating chaos every time you go up to a four-way stop.
Yeah.
And so the good thing about rules is that you prevent that situation from happening.
Gets everyone on the same page in a sense.
That's right. Or it gets, like, if we're talking about personal rules, it gets all your inner parts on the same page. Mm-hmm. Exactly. Like, all the inner parts of you create this rule, so you're in alignment when you're behaving, according to this rule. Now, let's pretend the rule of driving at a four-way stop was that whoever was going to be the nicest person just waves everybody through. Okay, maybe that's the rule of driving, the systemic rule of driving. If that was the case, it would be a disempowering rule, right? Like, that would be a bad one.
Yeah.
And so whoever, decides on those traffic pattern rules might want to reevaluate that particular one and go, perhaps we should implement something that's a little less confusing for everyone. Because that's how it used to be in the early days of cars, right? Like, they didn't even have stops. If you had an intersection,
honk your horn.
That's right. You honk your horn and you go. That's how it worked in the early days of cars. And then eventually they're like, maybe we should implement something that's a little bit more empowering as a rule.
So it's not contextual at every single intersection.
Yeah.
You have more of a pattern of how you can move through the world, and it streamlines everything.
That's right. And creates less confusion. And so on a personal level, when we're creating our own personal rules, being aware of them first, watching them come up for us, seeing when we feel bad, right? We get upset, and remembering that's a rules upset. Which rule just got upset, right? And if I can't identify it or find it, it must be one that's pretty unconscious. That's the first thing. And then second, ask yourself, is this a good one or a bad one? Do I want to keep this rule or do I want to throw it out? Is it an empowering or a disempowering rule?
Yeah. Our mutual friend, Cameron, tells this really interesting story of kind of a rule change in his life around food. He talks about when he was I think 6 or 7, he would go out to eat with his family, and anytime there was a different restaurant they were at or there was new food opportunities, he kind of had a personal rule that I don't like new foods, new things. I'm just going to stick with what I know. And he said he had this clarity moment one day when he basically saw a plate of food that was put in front of him with some new, interesting food. And he said, I think I've got a disempowering rule around food. He didn't use the words rule. We're using that for the sake of the context here. But I have a disempowering thought about food and about what kind of foods I like. I'm going to change this to be more exploratory. My rule is going to be to try new foods when I have them presented to me. And he said that day it changed for him. It opened a whole new world of exploration, a whole new world of possibilities when it came to cuisine and eating, because he changed a personal rule of his. And how many kids do you know, like, I'm not eating this, I'm not eating that, and they've got all these, have you ever been around a picky eater? They're miserable to be around because you want to go out to eat with some friends, and this picky eater can only eat, one type of food or two types of food. They've got this personal rule around what's acceptable to them for food consumption, and now they've kind of ruined it for everybody. In the sense of, well, if you just expand this to be a more empowering rule for yourself, we could all have more fun. We could all go to different places and try new things. So that's a simple example of a rule change of perspective, I think, that could make a big difference in someone's life. Yeah,
actually, that's another thing that Robbins mentions is that if the vast majority of people, when they look at their list of rules, if they get to that point of being able to chart them out, that most of us have created numerous ways to feel bad and only a few ways to feel truly good. Meaning that we have more rules that can easily be offended than we have rules that are more open frame. So like the rule that Cameron had, which is I can only eat a small amount of food in order to feel good, is way less easy to manage. It means that most food is going to make him feel bad, as opposed to the new rule change, which is I'm actually going to enjoy new foods. I'm going to enjoy foods I haven't eaten before, which made it so that feeling good was far easier to attain. So most of us actually have a lot of rules around things that end up making us feel bad.
Things we don't want.
Yeah, exactly. More rules around what we don't want than rules around what we do want.
Yeah.
That's exactly it.
So I guess how do we, one of the questions that begs the question, how do we begin to think about this and think about, charting out the rules we already have in place, comparing them, which ones are empowering, which ones are disempowering, and how can I, as a person, increase more of those empowering, open rules? And even as I say that, it starts to get really fuzzy and esoteric because it's so easy to make a rule around the things I don't like. I want people to take off their shoes when they come in the house, and I want people to sit at the dinner table a certain way, and I want people to treat me a certain way, and I want the shopkeeper to smile at me when I walk in a store. All these kind of like subconscious personal rules I have that if people break them or cut me off on the highway, I get upset. I haven't programmed myself to think in open terms as much, and how do I begin to change my perspective in that way? Because I think that could be really exciting for us as humans to begin to think in terms of empowering. And so let's unpack that. How do we go about some of these ways of thinking and changing our perspective?
Yeah, I think a really serious look at what your rules are, what your personal rules are, is one of the biggest trim tabs to getting to happiness. I think a lot, like Robin said, every upset is a rules upset. That means that every moment of happiness means that we had a rule around that action leading us to happiness, to feeling good. So knowing what your rules are and crafting them, like conscientiously crafting them in a way where happiness and feeling good is the result, is a massive leverage point to, in general, being happy. Like, it will increase our happiness if we understand what our rules are.
So I could see kind of a double-edged sword. One, reduce the amount of rules you have, probably would be in everybody's best interest. I'm sure you have somebody in your life that has a lot of like unspoken rules around being around them. And life's difficult with this person because everywhere you turn, you're offending one of their personal rules. And they're always upset because they're constantly being righteously indignant and upset about something. And it's like, this is not fun to be around this person. So if a person like that, or if this is you, to reduce the amount of things that can trigger upset in you, just eliminate those and say, this is no longer a rule of mine. If this happens, so be it. If it doesn't, so be it. But I'm not going to have a rule, quote unquote, personal rule around this. That's probably a huge step, just to remove a lot of things that are there. And then I think to add in as a vacuum, that creates a vacuum, add in some of these empowering rules. So I think there's that discipline of developing those. And I think the second part, and I think we could talk more about this, is being clear in your communication of what your personal rules are. You assume that everyone knows what your personal rules and maybe what we're talking about are boundaries here on certain things. But if you don't communicate that clearly, how's somebody else going to know this about you? How are they going to know that they're going to step on your toes or offend a particular rule of yours?
Yeah. We know somebody who was married to someone who every time he made her upset and he would say, "What did I do? How did I make you upset?" She would go, "Oh, you know." And he's like, "If I knew, I wouldn't have asked." Exactly. But she'd always go, "Oh, you know what you did." Well, you can't really expect somebody to obey or observe or honor or care about your rules if you can't articulate them, if you can't tell them to the other person, because that person is not a mind reader. So being able to articulate your rules is a big one. I think also being able to identify what a truly disempowering rule is a big piece. And Robbins talks about 3 different components to a truly disempowering rule. The first one is a disempowering rule is impossible to meet. That would make sense, right? If it's set up for failure, if this rule is going to constantly be offended, then it's a disempowering rule. It means that it's going to be making you feel bad all the time. So like a disempowering rule, like, we talked about how you're a little bit germophobic. And so every time your children come into the house, the rule of the house is that they immediately take off their shoes and they go over to the sink and they, in the kitchen sink, and they wash their hands, right? That's the rule. And a disempowering rule would be something to the effect of, well, actually the kids are pretty good about it. But if they don't wash their hands, right? Actually, how would it be impossible? I'm trying to think of your kids who are actually pretty good at being programmed, and they're pretty good at this.
Well, I think,
I know that they would never have to be reminded. If the rule was, not only do I want you to wash your hands after you go to the bathroom and after we come back in the house from someplace, and then I never have to remind you, right? Well, that would be impossible because they both need reminding pretty much very regularly. They need reminding. So that would be a rule that would be very disempowering for you because it would frustrate you, not that they didn't wash their hands, but that you had to remind them. That would be the rule. The rule is that I don't have to remind you. And that would be impossible. So basically every time we entered the house, that rule being offended would put you in a funk.
Yeah, I can see that. So that's number one, is it's impossible to meet. It's something that's a standard that would be 9 times out of 10 or even more, it's not going to be met. And by definition now, you feel bad because this rule is set up for failure from the beginning.
Oh my gosh, that was the first thing that I could think of, example that I could think of. And that's a really simple, easy day-to-day, day-in, day-out example. And it just dawned on me, probably one of the biggest, I don't know, examples of an impossible to fill rule is the list that I've seen single people have about what they're looking for in a mate.
Yeah.
Like, I know somebody who has a list of qualifiers for a mate that is literally 4 or 5 pages long.
And real specific, like what kinds of books and magazines they read. And it's a deal breaker if they don't. And not only the types of books or magazines, but like content-wise, but like nuanced to the point where not only do you have to own this book and love it, but you have to own the hardback copy of this book and love it.
Yeah, like not that you just read this magazine, but that you have a subscription to it and not the Kindle version.
Yeah.
Like you have to have an actual tangible subscription to the tangible magazine.
That's going to be definitely a rule that's going to cause you a lot of pain as a person. If you set up things like this in your life, these unattainable, parameters, by definition, you're going to be unhappy because it's never going to be met. People just, that's unrealistic.
Yeah. It's a thoroughly disempowering rule. The second qualifier is that what you can't control determines whether the rule has been met. So basically, in order for the rule to have been met, somebody else has to do it. Or outside components, outside influences, outside circumstances, things have to fall into place in order for your personal rule to be met.
Ah, okay.
And so that's very disempowering because you have no control over whether or not the rule happens, right? Like, we knew somebody who worked for someone who had a different sense of ethics than this person did. And the employee, they basically used marketing lists. They had these lists that they purchased every year. And the owner felt like once they had purchased the list, if they had called through the whole list, anybody that they had called through the list was now their lead, right? And so the following year, they didn't feel like they had to pay to renew that portion of the list. And the employee felt like they should give the same amount of money every year, not buying new lists, but just for the old list. And there was some gray area around it. It was like, ethically, you could kind of go either way. You can kind of see a case for one. I don't believe that the company that sold the list made it super clear. So it was kind of an ethical thing. It was like, yeah, I could kind of see this person, the employer's perspective, and I can kind of see the employee's perspective. But the employee had such a rule around it that every time the employer allowed a different employee to use that list, this employee would get really upset. Right?
Yeah.
They would get really, really frustrated and upset by it because it was a personal rule that they had handed the action over to someone else, which is if the other employee used that list, it offended this employee's personal rule. So that meant that it was out of their control. Yeah. So in order for their rule to be honored, the implementation was on somebody else's shoulders. Massively disempowering. You can't control what somebody else does.
Well, and this is why it's so frustrating for people when they attempt to legislate a morality perspective, like in government, for example. By definition, they're setting it up for unhappiness and difficulties because you're trying to legislate a personal conviction of yours across the board for everyone else, and they may not share that same conviction. And by definition, that's causing you kind of anxiety and pain because you can't control how people behave. You can't control their perspective. And you're trying to do it through legality means and other ways. It just gets messy and it doesn't work. That's why legislating morality doesn't work because You can't legislate your personal rules for everybody else. It's not gonna end well for you. And when it's been attempted, unless everybody's bought in, it doesn't end well, from what my perspective is.
At the very least, it will make you unhappy.
Yes.
Because other people won't care. So the third qualifier for a disempowering rule is that it gives only a few ways to feel good and lots of ways to feel bad. So the parameters of the rule are very small. Like things have to happen in an exact way in order for the rule to be honored. And that means that there's like a million ways for it to go bad and only one way for it to go good. That's a disempowering rule.
So if I'm somebody who really loves the Valentine's Day holiday, and I've got this personal rule that my lover should give me flowers and chocolates and take me to dinner at a particular type of restaurant, and we dress in a particular type of way, and those rules are not met that day, I've given myself very little latitude to be happy with my lover, my partner, because I've got all of these like expectations set up that haven't been met, and now by definition I'm unhappy again. Is that kind of what we're talking about here?
Yeah, basically. There's lots of ways for you to feel upset and only one way for you to feel good.
Yeah.
So we have a hierarchy of rules, just like we have a hierarchy of core values or values. There are certain rules that Robbins calls threshold rules, which are rules that we will never break. All right, there are core value rules. They are the things that define us. There is no way that we would ever possibly break this rule. My brother has a threshold rule around infidelity. I asked him if he liked the show Mad Men. He can't stand the show Mad Men because the main character is a philanderer, and he has total contempt for that. So that's a threshold rule of his. Like, infidelity is completely, like, that was something that he would never do. Then we have personal standards. And personal standards are rules that we don't like to break. So that's a little different. Threshold rules are something that we will never break. And personal standards are things that we don't like to break. And so the reason why it's good to understand the difference between the two is if your disempowering rules are populating your threshold rules, meaning that these things that you would never, ever, 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 ever offend also happen to be massively disempowering, that's probably why you're an unhappy person. Or rather, why you probably are an unhappy person. If you've got a lot of threshold rules that are disempowering, that seems like the formula for unhappiness.
Yeah, we with clients and people that we coach and talk to a lot, we ask a really pointed question that I think addresses some of this. And the question is this: would you rather be right or would you rather be happy? And I think that penetrates down to a rule level. Would you like to be right about the personal rule you've set up for yourself, and even if it's disempowering, or would you rather be happy and maybe reevaluate some of the personal rules you've set for yourself? Because happiness is a result of being a little more open and not having everything go the way you think it should go all the time. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. And there are moments when being right feels like it's what makes us happy, right? Like, being right there's so much like secondary payoff to the feeling of being right that we mistake that for happiness. Generally, though, it's just a momentary pleasure, and real happiness comes from being okay with not being right, like being willing to reevaluate. And if you want to marry your rules with happiness, Robbins says that the most empowering rule is to enjoy yourself no matter what happens. That's the most empowering of all rules. Enjoy yourself no matter what happens.
Yeah.
So go ahead and make that your rule. And then you get to be right and happy because your rule is so flexible.
Yeah. And I think we've both studied NLP also, which is neuro-linguistic programming. And there's a common kind of understanding in this that the person that is the most adaptable and most flexible, not that they compromise their core values, but from those core values, they're flexible in how they express those from a personal rule standpoint. They tend to be the most able to have influence in a situation and to be able to gain the most happiness in the outcome they ultimately desire, because they're not attached to a specific, this has to be the way it has to be. And that seems to be something that really opens up a lot of possibility for us as humans. If we can really see that kind of the adaptability and openness, still holding to our core values, but from the rule level, a little bit more contextual in a sense, rather than this is how it has to be, this rule. It's, well, let's go back one level. What's the core value this rule is trying to satisfy? And that's really what I want. That's what's bringing me happiness, is that core value being satisfied. And there are ultimately various ways to get to that core value. It doesn't have to be this one personal rule I've set for myself.
Yeah, this goes back to that whole concept of, have you outsourced your beliefs, your values? Have you outsourced your rules? Did somebody else give you this rule and you think that you're supposed to keep, carrying the torch? If you remember what the point of a rule is, that it's a shortcut for your brain to be able to make faster decisions, then it makes sense that before you would make the rule, that's when the thought would go into it. That's when you'd be really clear about whether or not you want this to be a rule. Because from then on, you stop thinking about the rule, right? The point is so that you don't have to think about it. The point is that it's a shortcut. So while you're designing your rules, while you're asking yourself what they are and kind of crafting them, feel free to put as much time, thought, effort, etc. into those as possible and make sure that they're all very empowering. And then once you integrate those empowering rules, now you don't have to think about them so hard.
I think the other thing that trips us up is we assume everyone has this assumption that other people have the same way and rules about things as we do. The classic example of the husband and wife fighting over how they work with a toothpaste tube. Do you squeeze it from the bottom? Do you squeeze it from the top? One has a rule of you squeeze it from the bottom. The other one maybe doesn't really think about it so much. So their rule is just wherever, it makes sense to them in the moment. And then it causes this tension. This is a real basic example of something that's kind of a rule upset. And now there's this tension around this. We are not, and we talked about this when we first started the podcast, we're not conscious about this. It's something that comes up for us. We have personal rules around everything that we're just not aware of half the time. I think of there's a friend I know who, when he talks to me, he walks right up and he gets right up in my personal space, and his spittle sometimes hits my face, and he's right there. And another friend of mine have commented on it. The guy's great. I love him to death. But he's he doesn't even aware that he's infringing on a rule of mine, and I'm not even aware that I have a personal space rule until someone comes into my space, and then all of a sudden I'm instantly aware of this personal space rule I've kind of got, a couple, hey, give me 2 feet, man. But it's through experience this comes up for us. And so I think it's also paying attention when things are triggered for you to begin to notice those. And we talked about a previous podcast about building awareness with the nuance, the things of life that annoy us, the annoyances of life. And I think this is another kind of play into that awareness, and then the rules that come with that awareness. Now that we've been made aware of them, what is my personal rule around this? And is that a empowering rule that I have around this? Or is it disempowering? So these are all different tools and techniques we can use to begin to unpack some of this in our personal life.
Mm-hmm. So let us know what some of your rules are. What are the things you get upset by or triggered by? Have you seen a rule that is surprising to you that you didn't realize was a rule? And what do you think it would take to incorporate the one rule of having fun no matter what? What do you think it would take to make that your meta rule? So let us know. Go over to personalityhacker.com to the podcast section and find this podcast and let us know in a comment. Or you can let us know on our Facebook page, Facebook / is there / or /?
It's /
Personality Hacker. Or on Twitter, which is Twitter
see if you can get this.
/ Personality Hack.
Yeah, they wouldn't let us do the whole hackers. We do Personality Hack.
That's right. And let us know. Keep the conversation going. Let us know what some of your rules are and what it takes to have empowering, happiness-producing rules. Subscribe to us if you like our podcast. We've got plenty of great content that we've already created and that's coming out in the future. And thanks for being part of our movement. So this has been the Personality Hacker Podcast. I'm Antonia Dodge.
And I'm Joel Mark Witt.
And we'll see you next time.